These notes cover the topic in Chapter 4, Section 5 on scope. Scope can be defined as the area of the program where a construct is accessible or usable. Our variables have these properties, so do our functions. These narrated notes will cover local scope, which includes inside a function or inside a code block. 2. Global scope. Local scope and functions. Variables and constants defined inside a function are available for use only inside the function that contains them. This is referred to as local scope to the function, or function scope. Good programming strategy keeps subprograms independent. This promotes reuse, black box style of programming, code that is easier to find and fix errors and maintain, and it makes it easier to work in teams on larger software. And so, C++ functions allow us to declare variables and constants within the context of particular functions where they're only allowed to be used. However, C++ does not allow us to declare or define other functions within our functions. Here is an example of local scope or function scope for a variable. In function getUserHeight, we see two local variables declared, ft and in for feet and inches. These become available once this function is executing, and they're only available as long as this function is executing. The scope of feet and inches starts right here where it's declared, right after our curly brace, and its scope or usability ends at the closing curly brace. So no other function has access or can use ft and in, these local variables that are especially designed and used inside getUserHeight. Local scope and code blocks. Here we see a for loop with count set to 1 at the beginning of the for loop. Count will be printed out with the value 1, then the value 2, then the value 3. Once count is incremented to 4, it no longer meets the criteria of the for loop, and so the next line of code would be executed. In this case, trying to print out count after the for loop will be an error. It is outside the scope of the code block of the for loop and is no longer usable or accessible. The second example shows the getUserGender function from our candy bar diet program. Notice that char gender was declared as a function variable right at the start of getUserGender. This makes it accessible for the entire function. If we change this and move char gender inside of the do while block and remove it from the outer block, this code will no longer work. Why? Because char gender is local to the block of the do while. And notice that the while comes after the closing brace of the do while. Therefore, trying to use gender compared to not equal to f and not equal to m it doesn't exist outside the scope of the do, and therefore this again would cause an error. So code blocks can declare their own variables, and then those variables are only allowed to be used within that very, very local block of code. Global scope, also known as file scope. This is when you define the variable or constant or the function prototype outside of any function. They're really only meant to be used for constants and function prototypes and definitions. Here we see the top of the program that computed total cost. We see the constant double sales tax initialized to 0.06 and the function prototype for total cost. It is okay to make these items global because the constant cannot be changed by any other part of the program. But it is not okay to make variables global. They break the rules of good structured programming, which allows for black box programming and independent subprograms, and it breaks the rules of good secure programming, because anywhere in the entire file, every function definition would have access to changing the variable, and that's a dangerous way to program. For your scope mastery, review Chapter 4, Section 5 in your text and try creating local blocks with declared variables inside functions and inside blocks within functions, and test them out to learn the details of this property called scope. Happy C++ coding!